Hello again. Welcome back to those who are rejoining us, and welcome to those who are joining today. We're going to continue with our series about Jews and crisis in America, and today we'll be looking at critical issues in American foreign policy and American immigration policy as we see them unfolding in the early part of the 20th century. The cartoon that you see on the slide with the illustration of the European anarchist with his bomb and his dagger sneaking up behind the Statue of Liberty is one of the signs that this period, this end of 19th century, early 20th century, a time that in American Jewish history is associated with the mass migration of over 2 million Jews into the United States, mostly from Eastern Europe. This is a time of great opportunity and a great promise, and yet it was also a time of great turmoil in American society. Certainly the depiction of the European anarchist coming to undermine democracy and the United States itself is an expression not only of the fact that, yes, there were violent incidents in the United States, starting most famously in Chicago with the Haymarket events of 1886, and in following decades, turmoil involving the left, the labor movement, and anarchism. These are topics that we will be dealing with in more depth as we go further along. But here I want simply to point out that crisis is embedded in the very time that we tend to associate with this great beneficial advent of millions of Jews trying to move to the United States to better their lot, to improve their fortunes, and to live in a land of freedom. This was up for very strenuous debate, and many Americans at the time felt that free, unrestricted immigration was not a good idea because it involved people who didn't come from democratic lands, didn't understand democracy, had no interest in supporting democracy, and were liable only to undermine what the United States felt it should possess, it should propound as its way of life. The illustration that I put up now, it comes really from the same period and from the same set of issues, only from a different angle. Obviously, we see Jews dressed in biblical attire, bearing the weight of oppression. The oppression is no longer that of Egypt, but it's being compared, of course, to the exodus of the Jews from Egypt in very, very stereotypical biblical form. And yet, over on the left, President Theodore Roosevelt is remonstrating with Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, over the oppression of the Jews. Why? Because, first of all, there is this question of humanitarian concern. Should the United States intervene in other countries when questions arise as to the treatment of the subjects or inhabitants or citizens of that other country? Where are the limits of the rules of sovereignty? This is something that we actually are witness to as we speak, when the United States is intervening in other countries, first in Venezuela and then in Iran, and nobody knows how, at this point, how these things will play out. But Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, standing there on the cliff and remonstrating with the Russian Tsar, he's not only intervening on behalf of Jews because it's a good thing to intervene. He's intervening because the point was Russia, through its policies, was exporting its problems or its dilemmas overseas. Jews were immigrating to the United States in large numbers, so that the Russian problem with the Jews was becoming an American issue because of mass migration, and hence the intervention of the American president in these issues, and American politics in general becomes caught up not only with the Jewish issue, but of course with the migration issue itself. By 1882, for instance, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, American lawmakers were already trying to restrict the immigration of populations whom they considered to be unwanted or undesirable. That was in 1882. By the time we get to 1921, that idea of restrictionism, that is barring or closing the doors of the United States to further mass migration from countries where who knows what kind of people might be coming from there, that has become an American majority opinion passed by Congress. So this issue of immigration, how does it impact on America's foreign policy in terms of intervention abroad? How does it impact on American domestic policy as to who are the people who are desirable and who are not desirable, who are assimilable and who are not assimilable? These are questions that were all basically part of a great national debate. I should point out that Jews in Western countries were similarly divided as to what was the best thing to do. Jews in Western European countries, in Germany and in England, were not terribly excited about the idea of becoming the site of resettlement by several million poverty-stricken Jews. Not only did they not have the resources to deal with them, but it was quite within the realm of possibility that the presence of masses of immigrant poor Jews speaking a different language, living with different habits, and so on, would endanger the status of the Jews already living in Western democratic countries. This was true in the United States as well, this divided opinion. Spoiler, it didn't help. In other words, the Jews spontaneously kept on emigrating to the West, and the United States was the country that absorbed the vast majority, over 75%, of all the Jews emigrating at that time out of Eastern Europe. But the debate was a debate, as I say, and it wasn't just the non-Jews who thought that this was a debatable issue. Even some people in the Jewish community wanted to debate whether this was a good idea or not. I put Emma Lazarus up there on the slide for you. All of you, of course, are familiar with Emma Lazarus, the poet whose sonnet, The New Colossus, was later posthumously engraved on a plaque inside the base of the Statue of Liberty. Famously, those famous lines, "Send me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me." All of these ideas about America serving as a refuge to the wretched of the earth, this was something that when she came to consider the Jewish people, she was ambivalent. In the end, on the one hand, she publicized very, very sharp polemical articles in the New York press defending the Jews of Russia against whatever slanders, whatever lies were being told about the Jews being oppressors of the peasants and that sort of thing, and therefore they deserve to be attacked in pogroms. She defended the Jews very strongly against that sort of thing. But when it came to what would be the best solution for the Jews of Eastern Europe, and there were about 5 million living just in the Russian Empire alone, Emma Lazarus came to the conclusion in the end that the United States was not the best place for them to come. The best solution would be, in her opinion, for the more affluent Jews in Western countries, such as the United States, to put their minds together to mobilize resources and enable a restoration of the Jews to the Holy Land. That is, to recreate a mass Jewish community out of Eastern Europe into Palestine. This is 10 years before Theodor Herzl. Emma Lazarus herself was a fifth generation born American Jew, but the United States, she felt, would never safely absorb the millions of Jews coming out of Eastern Europe, and it was a better idea for them to go elsewhere. She was wrong, but we can't blame her for that. The point here is that it was a crisis. This immigration era was a crisis not only for the Jews, but for the host societies in which the Jews were hoping to resettle, and Jews found different ways of coming to grips with the issue. One of the ways that they did try to intervene was by using some sort of influence that they might bring to bear on the powers that be in the world. And I begin with the figure that you see. There are three portraits on the slide. The lower left-hand portrait is of the Jewish financier Jacob Schiff, himself a former immigrant from Frankfurt, Germany, very successful investment banker in Wall Street. Jacob Schiff was the prime mover in anything involving the Jewish community in the United States, involving philanthropy, involving diplomacy. During the Russo-Japanese War, which took place in 1904 and 1905, Jacob Schiff made it his business to go and speak intensively with his fellow bankers in the world financial community and to campaign on behalf of the Japanese, that rather than allowing Russia, the oppressor of the Jews and the oppressor of all its other peoples, a free hand in waging a war against Japan, that Japan should receive financial credits to wage war against the oppressive Tsar of Russia. To some extent, he succeeded. Schiff indeed was he was certainly not the only one to provide war credits to the Japanese, but he was part of a larger campaign among his fellow financiers. What was the point? The point was to try and get the Russian government to budge from its decades-long policies of keeping the Jews of Russia restricted within the Pale of Settlement, as it was called, that swath of land along the western frontier of the Russian Empire where Jews were allowed to live, but not elsewhere, at least not formally by Russian law. Schiff thought that if Russia could ease and reform its anti-Jewish policies, first of all, the plight of the Jews would be less. The plight of the Jews would be ameliorated, and there wouldn't be such pressure on the Jews to leave Russia. And most of all, of course, these things worked hand in hand. You wanted Jews not to suffer, you wanted them not to be oppressed, and you also wanted them not to have to move intercontinentally. Schiff intervened in the Russo-Japanese War and subsequently. I put Teddy Roosevelt up there as well because it was Roosevelt who helped to broker the peace at the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Roosevelt, the same Teddy Roosevelt whom we saw previously, who similarly was concerned with this idea that what are we going to do about Russia and its oppressive policies. There were other issues involving Russia. For example, the American passport. Jews, for example, who had come from Russia, had done well in America and wanted to go back to Russia either on a visit or to conduct business or both, were being met by the anti-Jewish restrictions that were in place in Russia, despite the fact that they came holding an American passport. Schiff and other figures in the American Jewish community tried to turn this into a political issue, that the United States should do something about the fact that its passport was not being honored. Or, to put it another way, that the United States federal government and the State Department and its consuls abroad were being complicit in cooperating with an oppressive, tyrannic country like Russia in discriminating against Jews and, in fact, discriminating against American Jews holding the American passport. This all came to a head in what became the most successful example of Jewish political campaigning or influence, if you will, in the United States. In 1911, the old American-Russian trade agreement that originally was signed and created in 1832, it was due to end, and it should have been renewed for another long period of time in 1912. By 1911, this agreement had to be renegotiated and renewed. Schiff and others mounted a huge public campaign in the press and elsewhere and in Washington to convince Congress that it was time to abrogate the US-Russian trade agreement, precisely because the way that Russia was behaving domestically and also affecting the United States by doing what it was doing vis-a-vis Jews and others. The campaign was successful insofar as Congress did, in fact, refuse to renew that particular trade agreement. The other figure that you see, the other portrait next to Schiff in the bottom row, is President Taft. He was the president at the time when Schiff and others were spearheading this campaign to abrogate the trade agreement. And in a famous incident, Schiff and several of his colleagues were in the Oval Office to tell President Taft what they thought he really ought to be doing. And Taft was hemming and hawing. Taft didn't really want to push the United States into a full-scale diplomatic confrontation with Russia. He had his reasons. But at a certain point in his proceedings, Schiff simply got up, turned his back, took his people out of the Oval Office, and slammed the door. This is something that happened just a couple of weeks ago with the Prime Minister of Canada, but that's parenthetically. This was Schiff representing the Jewish voice and this stance of being able to speak to power, in this case the American president, in the name of Jewish interest, but Jewish interest wrapped in humanitarian concern. This was something that I think can be certainly considered a remarkable incident, and certainly one of the very few actual successes that Jewish influence or Jewish diplomacy achieved. By the time we get to 1914, just a few years after the abrogation campaign, The Great War breaks out in Europe, as we know. America is neutral until 1917, even though there's a great deal of pro-British opinion in the United States, but not everyone in the United States was sentimentally pro-British or prepared to do anything about it. There were three big ethnic groups in the United States at the time. One were the Irish. One were those who had come from Germany and Austria. And one were the Jews. The German-speaking groups were the single most populous ethnic bloc in the United States, following people whose ancestry was in Britain. The German Americans certainly were divided among themselves, but by and large it could be said that among former Germans or children of German immigrants living in the United States at the time, the idea of going to war against Germany and against Austria was not something that they supported. Because of the pro-Allied opinion in the United States during those initial years of the war, 1914 to 1917, there was a heavy anti-German campaign waged inside the United States against German supporters or those suspected of being German supporters. Even those who were in favor of American neutrality, in the end, were tarred with the brush of being pro-German. This was part of the propaganda campaign waged by the British government at the time that said those who support American neutrality are in fact supporting Germany and Austria and are in fact our enemies. So the Irish, whom I mentioned, obviously had their own reasons for being hostile to any alliance with the British government. And the Jews, what was their problem? Well, the alliance that eventually did take place between the United States and Britain and France, that alliance entailed Russia as well. And the Jews in the United States saw Russia as a hostile power. Many of the Jews in the United States were in fact immigrants who had arrived only recently from Russia. And they associated Russia and the Russian regime with oppression, with tyranny. Did they want the United States to go to war on behalf of the Russian imperial regime? So Jewish opinion was divided. Some felt that it was a good idea to simply be patriotic Americans and support what other Americans want to support. Others were saying, no, the United States has no business involving itself in the European war, and certainly has no business backing the Russians. What made this even more complicated was the fact that on the Eastern Front, World War I was being fought precisely on those lands that contained the bulk of the Jewish population of the world. From the Baltic Sea, from Poland, what is today Poland and Ukraine, parts of what were then Austrian Galicia, the province of Galicia, that was part of the Austrian Empire. All of those lands and the Russian front, the Pale of Settlement straddled the border area of the Russian Empire. This was the battleground. And this is where mass deportations and ethnic cleansing was going on against Jews throughout these initial years of the war. So Jews in the United States had ample reasons, either because their own ancestors had come from Germany and therefore weren't terribly excited about the idea of going to war against Germany and Austria, or because they had come from Russia and didn't want the United States to fight on behalf of the Russians. These divided opinions were in fact a big crisis. And if we're going to make it even more complicated, by the time we're getting to 1914, 1915, there were quite a number of vocal Jewish socialists in the United States, and we'll talk about that next time, Jews on the left, the socialists took the position that the war was a war of great imperial powers amongst themselves. It was a war in which working people had no interest and were simply cannon fodder for the world's capitalists and imperialists, and the United States should remain neutral. All of this is going on until 1917. In 1917, in April of 1917, the United States decides to enter the war on the side of the Allies. And then one of the questions becomes, well, how can we convince Russia to remain in the war? Because by the time all of this is going down, in April 1917, there was already a revolution in Russia that had deposed the Russian emperor. There was now a provisional government in Russia, not yet the communist revolution. That would come several months later in October. But the February Revolution, so-called, which was March in terms of the calendar the rest of the world used, the February Revolution had toppled the Russian Tsar. And the question was, how can the Allies convince the Russian army and the Russian regime under the provisional government to remain in the war and continue the fight against the Austrians and the Germans? It was widely thought by anti-Semites and philo-Semites alike that Jews who were stereotypically seen as part of the radical wing in Russia supporting the revolution, Jews probably would have some important things to say in Russia about whether or not to carry on fighting the war. And the idea that Jews might be an influential group of people, that was in the air. It was being talked about, again, by anti-Semites as well as philo-Semites. The friends of the Jews are also willing to buy into this idea that Jews had a certain clout, that Jews had something to say that had influence. Whether or not that was a factor is still a matter of historical debate. Nevertheless, it is true that in November 1917, just as the provisional government in Russia was being toppled, Britain issues the Balfour Declaration, in which it said, with American support, President Wilson of the United States told the British that he would fully support this declaration, that His Majesty's government would view with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The wording is very vague. The wording also includes without any damage to the rights of anybody already living in Palestine, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, the Balfour Declaration is issued in 1917, and it's one of the first indicators that Jewish interests in one way or another are going to become part of the discussion of the peace. How is the world going to look once the war is won? Hopefully the United States felt that it was going to help the Allies win the war. Russia did indeed pull out of the war after the October Revolution, but the British and the French and the Americans carried on, as we know, eventually to a victorious conclusion in November of 1918. What's going on with Turkey and the Armenians, the slaughter of the Armenians, which served as a precedent to the genocide against the Jews later on under the Nazi regime in World War II. The Armenians had their supporters in the United States, in various churches and in the Red Cross, but Turkey also was still the power occupying Palestine. And it was in the process of deporting Jews from Palestine, mainly because most of those Jews held passports, or they were subjects of an enemy state, namely Russia. They had come from, many of the Jews in Palestine, not certainly by no means all. There were about 90,000 Jews living in Palestine at the time. Many of them were from Muslim countries, some had come from Central Asia, but a very large number had come from Russia. And they were being deported by the Turks, and others were being deprived of rights and livelihoods and so forth. There was a crisis, even to the extent of starvation, imminent in Palestine, and it was the American former ambassador to Turkey, Morgenthau, of a Jewish origin. Morgenthau helped to organize the intervention of an American supply ship to bring food and medical supplies to Palestine for the benefit of civilians, chiefly the Jews in Palestine, who were then being threatened by poverty and starvation. But Morgenthau and his intervention in Palestine were not the only story here. The United States could intervene in Palestine because the United States, although it declared war against Austria and Germany, did not declare war against Turkey. As far as the Americans were concerned, the United States was still a neutral power vis-a-vis Turkey, and so the intervention was possible. But as I say, this story with Morgenthau and the intervention in Palestine was not the only story. In 1914, because the war in Europe was being waged so much in the lands where most of the Jews of the world were living, Jews in the United States got together very quickly to bring succor, to bring support, to bring funds to bear in behalf of their brothers and sisters and cousins in Eastern Europe in particular. And thus was founded in 1914 an organization called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint for short, which still exists today. And the Joint Distribution Committee's task was to try and to funnel humanitarian aid to Jews in Eastern Europe caught in the combat zone. And this worked fairly well while the United States was still neutral, as we remember, until April of 1917. So there were many ways in which Jews involved themselves in this process of how should the United States intervene, where should it intervene, should the United States go to war, should Jews mobilize and be recruited into the army along with others. There are some very, very interesting things going on there after April of 1917, when the Russia issue is more or less solved because of the revolution in Russia. There's a provisional government. The provisional government throws down all of the anti-Jewish policies of the former Tsar, and Jews are emancipated in Russia along with the rest of the Russian people. The Russia question now actually is resolved, and many Jews in the United States who had opposed going to war on behalf of Russia, now they were okay with it. They were okay with going to war on behalf of the Allies simply because it was a new Russia that the United States would be helping. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, Russia did in the end withdraw from the war. The United States does go in, and Jewish soldiers are involved in the American Expeditionary Force. About 250,000 American Jews were soldiers of the United States in World War I. The World War I story carries on into the years immediately following. Because of the Russian Revolution and because of the establishment of new countries on the territory of the former Russian Empire and the former Austrian Empire, new countries such as Poland and Lithuania. Ukraine also tried to gain its independence at the time, and it's, again, uncanny how the Ukraine question of the time is once again relevant actually right now, at this very minute. Ukraine fought for its independence against forces from Russia. Jews were caught in between. There were widespread massacres of untold proportions. Up to 150,000 Jews were killed, and many, many more were displaced, deported, raped, and so forth during the years of 1919 to 1921. There was a war between Poland and Russia, the new Soviet Russia, or about to become Soviet Russia, over a question of borders and territories. And there, once again, there were massacres of Jews, mainly by Polish forces, and so on. So these questions were blatantly to the fore in the immediate aftermath of the war. And because of that, when it came time to frame the peace agreement, which became known as the Versailles Agreement, because the peace talks were held in Versailles, outside of Paris, in 1919, in the first half of the year of 1919. One of the issues before the peace conference was, well, how do we protect the national minorities, Jews as well as other national minorities? Because as the borders were being redrawn across the face of Eastern and Central Europe, there were blocks of populations that were stranded in the neighbor's country. Romanians and Hungarians and Ukrainians and Poles and Lithuanians and Germans and Jews scattered across different borderlines, and they became national minorities in these new countries that were being formed. Should they have extra protections? Should they be recognized as national groups with rights as such? The American Jews, in the form of a new organization that started during World War I, in 1916, the American Jewish Congress voted to send a delegation to the peace conference to demand special rights and protections for the Jewish minority because they were under the gun and they were suffering disproportionately from these rampant massacres and ethnic cleansings, and the idea that Jews in the United States were fine with being equal citizens along with everyone else, but in Europe, in Eastern Europe in particular, in these new countries like Poland, Jews were not going to be protected unless they were recognized as having rights as Jews, that is, as a collective community, to be recognized as such and to have special protections written into the peace agreement. All of these matters came before the leadership of the American Jewish community. Why? Because the United States, by intervening in World War I, made itself into a global power for the first time. It was, in fact, World War I that made the United States the major player in European and world events that we now recognize as having characterized American foreign policy and geostrategic interests ever since then. And the American Jewish community in its various guises, the Joint Distribution Committee, the American Jewish Congress, the person who represented the American Jewish Congress in Versailles was Louis Marshall, who actually headed a different organization, the American Jewish Committee. But Louis Marshall took it upon himself to represent the American Jewish position, including the demands for minority rights. In the end, certain minority rights were incorporated in the peace agreement of 1919, and this also could be attributed, in part at least, to the success of American Jewish efforts on behalf of their fellow Jews. We'll see how some of this played out in further crises and further developments in the 20th century next time. Thank you very much.